With a lifetime interest in aviation, Garry is proud to have had several roles here at QAM, including events manager, tours manager, marketing manager, and now president. I'd like to acknowledge too that, like his dad, Christopher is an active volunteer at QAM, and I'm delighted that he's here to keep us on the straight and narrow tonight and share in our celebrations. Garry has just signed a contract with New South, which is UNSW Press, to publish his biography of Australian war correspondent and official historian of Australia in the Second World War, Gavin Merrick-Long. Garry's going to now talk to us about looking forward. Thanks, Garry.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, everyone. Right. 50 years. I don't know if you're feeling old. I don't know if the museum is feeling old. At 50 years, I heard somebody say the other day, you know you're getting old when three things happen. Firstly, you start to lose your memory. You know, you begin to forget things. And I can't remember what the other two things were. When we began preparing for the 50th celebration, we were very keen to call it the first 50 years, because it automatically begs the question, well, what about the next 50 years? Does this wonderful enterprise that we are all a part of actually have a future? Will these airframes all around us survive another 50 years? Will this place, these buildings that we operate in, last another 50 years? Will volunteers continue to be willing to provide our workforce? Will there be a QAM in 2074 to celebrate 100 years? Now, asking questions like this can make your brain hurt. You think, 50 years from now? Well, I won't be around to see it. I've got quite a lot on my plate right now. I can't bring myself to think about something 50 years in the future. Well, fair enough. And it's a safe bet that quite a few of us won't be around to see QAM celebrate 100 years. But think of this. There are people here tonight in this place who were at the beginning in 1974. Their vision, their courage, their hard work, their sheer resilience laid the groundwork, and here we are. That time went fast. I'm guessing you guys had no concept of a 50th anniversary in 1974 when things were kicking off. So consider it this way. 1974 is as far away from us today as 2074. We got here very quickly from 1974. The next years will obviously continue to move us fast. Let me put it another way. Hayden Herford, are you here? Can you stand up, please? Right. There's Hayden, right down the back. Some of you know Hayden, some of you may not. Hayden is our youngest volunteer. Hayden is a trainee pilot. Hayden is an Air Force cadet. Hayden has career ambitions in the Air Force, and he's brilliant. It's great having him around the place. Now let's imagine Hayden in 2074, shall we? How do you feel? He's retired now. After a long and honourable career in Air Force, he retired as an Air Marshal, having served energetically as Chief of Air Force, and now in his retirement, he's volunteering at the Queensland Air Museum. In fact, he's now President. Good on you, Hayden. You can sit down if you'd like. He stands here as president of the Queensland Air Museum in this exact place, although I guarantee not this exact structure, looking back on tonight and remembering that he was here in 2024 as we celebrated our 50 years. Now, Hayden, as president, you're going to be required to give an inspirational speech. So the transcript of this is available to you if you'd like to use it. Refer back to it, you know. My point is, whether or not it's hard for us to think about 50 years into the future, people like Hayden and other young people who come through our front counter this year are going to look back someday on what we did in 2024. What decisions did we make? What plans did we develop? What hopes did we have for the future? And what commitment did we bring to doing whatever it takes to lay a good foundation in 2024 for generations to come? Now, we do have to ask some hard questions. What will it take to ensure that our airframes survive the next 50 years in good shape? How will we best preserve our collection, our books, documents, uniforms, artefacts, artworks into the future? What aspects of our infrastructure have another 50 years of life in them? And are they fit for purpose even now, let alone in the challenging years to come? How will we maintain our volunteer base in a world where volunteering is in decline? I believe that rain is considered a blessing on the QAM. Thank you. So what about the next 50 years? And who is responsible to plan and prepare and work towards that future, if not us? There was a time before social media, before TripAdvisor, when the Air Museum here had a visitors book, and people were encouraged to make comments in there as they looked around and as they were leaving. The QAM founding member and historian Ron Cuskelly is very fond of quoting the gentleman who, after a bit of a look around, wrote this: "We'll be good when it's finished." When it's finished. Well, of course, there's both a negative and a positive way to use the word finished. In the positive sense, finished can mean fully realised, complete, arrived at its destination. In the negative sense, finished might mean knackered, all washed up and dead. Well, let's stay with the positive, because let's face it, even though there are no guarantees that this enterprise has a future, the very fact that there are no guarantees can be a cause for action, not despair. Of course, there are no guarantees, and indeed some other museums have not survived, and some others perhaps won't survive. But there are many good reasons to believe that not only does this museum have a future, it has a bright future. We'll be good when it's finished. And of course, even looking at the positive side of that statement, will this enterprise ever be finished? Surely a healthy, vibrant, mature enterprise such as ours will only remain vibrant and healthy if it never sits down and says, "Phew, all finished. Nothing more to do." Now, that doesn't mean we have to keep growing in size as if there are no limits. But we do need to continue to adapt and change and learn and, yes, improve. You might say that while the footprint of our property here will never be as big as we might like, at the same time we are in fact operating in the biggest room in the world, the room for improvement. Thank you, Stan. Let us hope that this enterprise is never finished improving in its culture, its operations, and its professionalism. Now, A bright future can only begin, not end, with stirring rhetoric. What will those in future years see when they look back on this year? What are we actually doing right now that they will be able to point to and be grateful for? What are we actually doing? Well, in addition to the energetic day-to-day operations of the museum, there is quite a bit going on at a strategic level right now. At the end of tonight, you'll receive a copy being unveiled tonight for the first time of our strategic plan. When I took on the role of President last August, I said my number one priority was for us to develop a strategy, because even though strategies had come and gone in the past, it's not as if we were the first ones to think of this, we didn't actually have one. Well, we now do. We now do. And people like these, under the, I'll show you in order from left to right, under the project management of Nick Woods, we have there Cam McPhee, who's recently come on as our marketing manager. We have Penny Crebin, Chris Morley and Paul Coker, who have been meeting with me weekly all year, following those 3 workshops we did last year. You remember those? 3 half-day workshops. Everyone had a chance to have a say. We got together with what they said and drew together the strategic plan. And the strategic plan has 4 priorities: our volunteers, our infrastructure, our strategic partnerships, and our digital capability. Now, you'll notice that they're laid out horizontally, not vertically, and you'll notice they're not numbered 1 to 4. Each one is important, and you might want to think of a 4-bladed propeller where, if I can understand things correctly from a pure civilian's point of view, each blade in that 4-bladed propeller contributes to the stability and effectiveness of the prop. Is that close enough to... Yeah, okay. So each one of those is like the 4-bladed prop on our P3 Orion. When we talk about volunteers, it was very clear that we needed a better approach to recruit, deploy, train, encourage and embrace our volunteers. Already we have a volunteers coordinator and an assistant volunteers coordinator who are working very energetically and very effectively to improve the experience of our volunteers and to recruit more. Part of this plan includes recommendations and very clear actions that we can take to continue to develop our volunteers. Infrastructure, we'll come to that in a second. Partnerships, strategic partnerships with local council, state government, federal government, Chamber of Commerce, tourism department, people around us in our community, etc. These are the kinds of relationships that we will nurture and develop in a more strategic sense from here on. And there are actions in our strategic plan to make that happen. And finally, the digital capability. Nicole very aptly pointed out the huge role that the digital world now plays in every aspect of life, including museums. And so we need to have a look at what we're doing: collections management, communication, interactive displays, all of the elements that digital can help us with, and make sure that that's included in our operations as well. Let's concentrate now on infrastructure, and then I will finish. A part of the development of our infrastructure plan was to launch the Jubilee Master Plan, which is happening right now. It's happening tonight. We've been working on it for months, and again, under the able leadership of Nick Woods as project manager, a team has been working away on this to see what we can come up with. That's what we came up with. You've seen it before, I know. Just make sure you have a look and enjoy it. Air and Space Museum. Okay. No, that's not what we've come up with. But that kind of, in a way, does introduce where our problems lie. The air and our space. the air being the environment we work in, and our limited space here. Now, we are exposed to the elements here at every level. Our volunteers are exposed to blistering hot days, sitting at the front counter in Hangar 1, unable to down tools without shutting the place. Our guys are out on these aircraft in the blazing sun. And in the rain, they have to stop work. So our volunteers are exposed to the elements. Our collection is also at risk from the elements. Salt air, dust, sun damage, moisture, humidity. And finally, our visitors are exposed to the elements here. Stifling heat in Hangar 1, boggy ground because of the rain, UV radiation in the skin cancer capital of the world. And let's face it, what parent on school holidays isn't on the lookout for an undercover, comfortable venue to take the kids for a day? Exposure to the elements is one of our chief challenges when we think of our infrastructure. Add to that our lack of space, and you can see that we actually do have to do some serious thinking and some serious work. So, headed up by Nick Woods, as I say, who has been meticulously, as the true scientist that he is, been gathering data, gathering evidence, so that whatever we come up with, we can be sure it's the right solution. He's been talking with key volunteers, and recently we've engaged the services of architect Duncan Betts, who offered his services pro bono to this point. And we've done some significant work already, and we now need to have some museum-wide serious conversations arising out of a preliminary master plan that is now ready to unveil to you. Now, this is very preliminary. A lot of work's been done on it, but there's no way in which this is the end of the story. A conversation starter is what this is, not a conversation killer. So I'm going to flick through 14 slides quickly, and I'm not going to make much comment because they really deserve a lot of comment, and tonight's not the time. But we wanted to let you know how far we've come so that we can take the next step. These are all from the architect. Reworking the entire block, but allowing for Hangar 1 to stay where it is, partly because council owns it, we don't, but partly because it's part of our story. Okay, there's all sorts of drawings here that you don't need to go into. Just know that they've been drawn, and one day you'll get a chance to have a look. It's going to get exciting in a moment. Now, we're going to schedule some more half-day workshops very soon to lay all of the cards out on the table, to hear your questions and suggestions and go through the thinking and the evidence behind it. Because I know that in 100 minds tonight, looking at those images, I think 100, yeah, but what about questions came up immediately, right? So we want to hear all of those, and we want to address all of those. One thing I will say, we obviously don't know how much any of this is going to cost yet, but I can say, with confidence, we won't be able to afford it. So let's get our plan right first. Our current operating budget is not meant for that kind of project. Let's get the plan right and then have something to present to people when we seek sponsorship and funding and donations and so on. Remember, a lot of serious groundwork has already been done, but this is a conversation starter, not a conversation killer. Nothing is going to be foisted upon us. Every one of us will be given opportunity to contribute. We will not rush, but we will move as expeditiously as possible in an orderly, careful way, recognising that some of our needs here really are urgent. and they will have to be addressed first. So let me conclude. No, come back a second. Let me conclude. What we do here is important. Right, this isn't just a place to get out of the house for a couple of days, is it? It might be that, that's terrific. It might be a place to socialise, but what we do here is important. We are preserving a legacy on behalf of generations who have gone before and generations who are to come. So let us view open-mindedly and soberly the opportunities and challenges around us today, and let us honour the boldness, the courage and the resilience of those who have gone before by being bold and courageous and resilient as we do whatever it takes to ensure that the Queensland Air Museum has a bright future. Thank you, but I think we should finish with a good old-fashioned call and response, all right? This is from my old liturgical days. I tell you what, we're all going to get into this. I'm going to say, the Queensland Air Museum, you are going to say, onward and upward. All right, sounds silly. You'll love it. Let's do it. The Queensland Air Museum, onward and upward. The Queensland Air Museum. Let's hear it. The Queensland Air Museum. Last time, the Queensland Air Museum. Thank you.